about how trauma affects development, and especially development across the lifespan. And I wanted to show you guys this CT image. So Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a leading psychiatrist in the States and has an organisation called Childhood Trauma Academy, does a lot of research into childhood trauma, especially, I guess, the impact on the brain development. And this is an image of two 3-year-old children. So the image on the left is a normal 3-year-old child with an average sized brain. And the image on the right is another 3-year-old child who has been subjected to pretty extreme neglect, and neglect in the form of, minimal exposure to touch, minimal exposure to language, minimal exposure to kind of social interaction. So more than likely this 3-year-old child was, left in a crib for long periods of time, wasn't held, wasn't picked up, wasn't spoken to, wasn't rocked, all of those normal kind of, expected sort of ways of supporting a baby and a child. And what these CT scans show, that due to that extreme neglect, that brain size literally is, almost kind of that, almost like a third of a normal sort of brain development. And we can also see some really abnormal sort of development in the cortex around sort of how that brain is looking and developing in those black spots as well. So we know that the first 1,000 years of a child's life is so crucial and so important in terms of developing healthy attachment to people and being able to regulate and feel safe in the world. And unfortunately, we know that when children have been exposed to some pretty serious trauma and neglect in this situation, that there are going to be lifelong consequences. So behavioural consequences, learning consequences, emotional consequences, a range of things. So I always find this image pretty confronting to see, actually, but really important to understand that trauma does literally change the brain. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but the brain is a marvelous organ and it can repair as well. So, we often see that when children are removed from that environment and then start to have more positive interactions in the world and those basic needs start to be met, then the brain heals and the brain changes, and the brain can change in terms of its structure and function. So that's the most important and positive thing. But yeah, lifelong sort of issues that might develop for children exposed to significant trauma, as these CT scans depict. There was a study that I came across that talked about how child abuse survivors, what the outcomes might be later on in life, especially when some of those protective factors we were talking about before, especially when those protective factors are a little bit more absent. So this study showed that child abuse survivors are 2.5 times as likely to have poor mental health outcomes. So we know once again that brain, that the impact on the brain, and more likely to have, depression and anxiety and, other sort of mental health difficulties. Child abuse survivors later in life, they're 4 times more likely to be unhappy, even as they get older as well. So a lot of sadness and feelings of unhappiness. They're more likely to have poor physical health. And because of trauma and that release of stress hormones, we know that stress causes inflammation in the body, and that inflammation in itself can turn into disease and have, different medical impacts. So child abuse survivors, they're at risk of having 3 or more medical diseases as well. You can see that in that case study in that client that I discussed earlier. So a lot of medical issues as well. They're at higher risk of broken relationships. We see that as well in adults. A lot of clients who struggle to have kind of healthy adult intimate relationships for lots of different reasons. It might be scary to get too close to people, but then it's also scary if people leave. So this kind of sort of volatility in their personal and intimate relationships. So more kind of broken and, separations and things like that. Less likely to have less likely to have less social support, child abuse survivors, more likely to live alone, more likely to show suicidal behaviour, more likely to smoke, use substances, more likely to be physically inactive. So a range of impacts that are possible on how, child abuse survivors move through their life and the trajectory of their life, I suppose, in terms of their outcomes. So yeah, some pretty confronting and big things to think about as well, and to be aware of. So even more reason for people to be accessing support, and for the way that we interact with people who've experienced trauma as well, because we can also make a difference in terms of these outcomes. All right, so we're going to move on and touch on interpersonal violence and trauma. So we're looking at family, domestic and sexual violence within interpersonal close relationships. And I know that this has been sort of a big area across the media. There's, a lot of movements, and, you've got the white ribbon and the white ribbon walk and things like that. So a really important area to be aware of. And I think it's a major sort of national health and welfare issue, interpersonal violence at the moment, because sadly, some of the data and statistics are getting worse. So there's, it's a real national priority, I suppose, to be looking at this and thinking about how can we improve the outcomes around interpersonal violence, and how is that linked to trauma. But I wanted to share a few stats with you that I found in some of the latest research. So 2.2 million Australians have experienced physical and/or sexual violence from a partner. 3.6 million have experienced emotional abuse from a partner. So that's a huge number. 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men have been sexually harassed. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current cohabitating partner. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced stalking. In 2017, police recorded 25,000 victims of sexual assault. And this last stat, 1 woman is killed every 9 days and 1 man is killed every 29 days by a partner. So some pretty confronting, astounding statistics around this as well. And we know that it affects all ages, backgrounds, but predominantly women and children, but definitely not minimising men who are victims in interpersonal violence as well. A pretty big national priority, I think, interpersonal violence. And once again, sort of I will make that statement that, possibly yourself or somebody else close to you has, had experience with interpersonal violence. So can be quite a distressing and upsetting topic as well. So please feel free to take a break at any point. Now, I wanted to just touch on and introduce this wheel. So it's called the Power and Control Wheel, and it's a way of people understanding how perpetrators gain power and control over their victims in these interpersonal violent relationships. So really how it's our understanding of how abusers operate. And it's really important that we have some knowledge around this, and we can see the kind of red flags and be on the lookout for some of these things and how it presents in relationships, because for a perpetrator, it might be their way of gaining power and control of that victim in that interpersonal relationship. And I'll give you some examples as we go through each section. And I particularly think of a client and a family that I've worked with, and it's probably the most serious example of interpersonal violence that I've ever been exposed to working in my career. And my client was the 15-year-old son, the male, and working with him and his mum. And the perpetrator, the father, he's still currently in jail serving a really long extended sentence for multiple offences and charges. But probably the worst story of interpersonal violence that I have heard. And we move to that first section of using coercion and threats. So as a way to gain power and control, this is a typical way for perpetrators to have that power and control. So they make threats, going to threaten to hurt you, to leave you, going to report you, and this particular case that I'm referring to, I remember that the father would constantly, threaten that I'm going to burn your parents' house down, so the grandparents' house, and make these constant threats as well, threaten to hang them and kill them and all sorts of things. So making, the victims obviously, extremely scared and frightened in that situation. We see using intimidation a lot in interpersonal violence. So trying to make someone afraid and intimidate them by different gestures and looks and actions. And this particular case, the father permanently had a grave dug in the background as a way to intimidate this family. And so that grave just, stood there in the background as a reminder that you do anything, I will kill you and I'll bury you in that backyard. And he used to hang up guns in the house as just that intimidation as a reminder. He used to show them the leads he was going to use to hang them and all sorts of things. So these are obviously more extreme examples of intimidation, but once again, just, more kind of methods of having that power and control. Emotional abuse, so moving through the will, so using emotional abuse, so a lot of name calling, mind games, humiliating someone. This father used to constantly put mum and the son down, you're worthless, you mean nothing, humiliate them, force them to eat until they vomited, all sorts of kind of emotional abuse and things like that, and making them feel stupid and crazy as well with these mind games. Using isolation is another big thing that we see in order for abusers to gain power and control. And using jealousy to justify actions in this isolation, this is a big one. So, I love you so much, so therefore, I couldn't stand if, you go out or if anyone else sees you. And just because I love you so much and I couldn't stand to lose you. But it's really, and making sure that that person's isolated and not spending time, limiting their contact with other people. This particular father used to constantly check the odometer reading in the car to see how far they had travelled. So using any means to isolate people, you're not allowed to see those friends or, your parents, things like that, in order to gain that control. Moving through the will, so denying, minimising and blaming. So that sounds like, what are you talking about? You're crazy, you're an idiot, that didn't happen, or you're just making a big deal out of nothing, you're the unwell one, you're crazy. That sort of just constantly minimizing it, not making it a big deal, and constantly making that victim feel like they're to blame. I got angry because you said that or you did that, and not taking in that responsibility. We see using children a lot for perpetrators to gain that power and control. Go tell your mum this, or tell your mum that you love me. Using children to relay messages. Making threats like, I'll take you to court and I'll get full custody. Look how crazy you are. You're unwell. The courts aren't going to give you custody if you, try and leave me. I'm going to gain full custody. Those types of things. Using privilege to gain power and control. I'm the male, you're the female. This is what your job is. This is what my job is. These are our roles. Building that real hierarchy into that kind of family system. And that last one, using economic abuse. You're not allowed to work, trying to ensure that they don't have any independence, giving them some allowance. You're allowed to spend this much per week, controlling all the money, not allowing them access to bank accounts, all of that sort of thing. So there's a range of tactics that can be pretty confronting and scary, actually. And when someone's in that situation, it can be really hard to sort of see and to pick up on some of this stuff, because we know that the perpetrators can be, pretty skillful around this as well. So a range of ways that people gain power and control in interpersonal violence. So to just a mini personal reflection for just a minute. So we're not going to break off, we're not going to discuss this at all, but in your workbooks, just take a minute to write down, what experiences have you had with witnessing elements of the wheel? Possibly, in a friend's relationship, or, you've noticed something with your mate, the way he's, treated his girlfriend, or whatever it is. But just take a moment to think about, have you seen any of those elements of the wheel in real life? So write that down for me. Not forced to share or anything like that, but it's more just of a reflective exercise for yourself.